Most Christians have never heard the real story behind the Old Testament. What you learn in Sunday school is only the surface. Scattered stories about Noah's Ark, David and Goliath, and Moses parting the sea. The original structure? Far more challenging, radical, and transformative than you ever imagined. In 15 minutes, discover what the Old Testament actually meant to ancient Israel, and why understanding its hidden architecture will revolutionize how you read every single page of your Bible. This isn't a collection of random moral tales. This is a carefully orchestrated revelation of God's character and humanity's destiny, woven together through literary genius that most believers never recognize. The Hebrew authors weren't just recording history. They were crafting theology. The Torah wasn't just law. It was identity formation for a people who had forgotten who they were. Genesis doesn't begin with creation because Moses wanted to teach science. It begins with creation because enslaved Israelites needed to understand that their God, not Pharaoh, was the true sovereign of the universe. Every genealogy, every ritual, every seemingly mundane regulation was designed to answer one burning question. Who are we, and who is our God? Genesis reveals a pattern that governs all of human history. It's not coincidence that the book contains exactly 10 genealogies and 10 major narratives. The Hebrew authors are showing us that history moves in cycles, each generation facing the same fundamental choice between blessing and curse, life and death. Adam chooses disobedience. Cain chooses violence. Noah's generation chooses corruption. Abraham chooses faith. Isaac chooses blessing. Jacob chooses transformation. Joseph chooses forgiveness. But here's what most Christians miss. Genesis isn't primarily about individual salvation. It's about God choosing a family to heal the nations. When God calls Abraham, the promise isn't, "I'll get you to heaven." The promise is, through you, all families of earth will be blessed. Every story in Genesis points forward to this cosmic mission of restoration. Exodus wasn't just about freedom from slavery. It was about the birth of a new kind of nation. When Moses leads Israel out of Egypt, he's not just conducting a rescue operation. He's demonstrating that there's an alternative to empire. Egypt represented the ultimate human civilization. Advanced technology, massive wealth, absolute power concentrated in one man who claimed to be divine. God's response? I'll build a nation where every person matters, where justice flows down like rivers, where the poor are protected and the stranger is welcomed. The 10 Commandments weren't moral suggestions. They were constitutional principles for a society that would look completely different from anything the world had ever seen. No other ancient law code protected slaves, required rest for workers, or demanded justice for immigrants. Israel's law was revolutionary social engineering, designed to prove that God's ways produce human flourishing. Leviticus reveals the most misunderstood truth in the entire Old Testament. Modern Christians see ritual and think outdated ceremony. Ancient Israelites saw ritual and thought access to the divine. Every sacrifice, every purification rite, every festival was answering the most important question humans have ever asked. How can unholy people approach a holy God and live? But Leviticus goes deeper. The holiness code wasn't about earning God's favor. It was about reflecting God's character. When God says, "Be holy as I am holy," he's not demanding perfection. He's demanding difference. Be set apart. Be distinct. Show the world what it looks like when people actually live under God's rule instead of human tyranny. The dietary laws, the clothing regulations, the agricultural restrictions, none of this was arbitrary legalism. Every rule was designed to keep Israel constantly aware that they were different, chosen, set apart for a purpose bigger than themselves. They were meant to be a living demonstration that God's ways work. Numbers wasn't just wilderness wandering. It was leadership training for a generation that would conquer kingdoms. The 40 years in the desert weren't punishment for unbelief, though unbelief certainly played a role. They were preparation. God was transforming a slave mentality into a conquest mindset. Every test, every rebellion, Every miraculous provision was designed to teach Israel one crucial lesson. Dependence on God leads to victory, while self-reliance leads to defeat. The census numbers, the tribal arrangements, the marching orders, this wasn't mere organization. This was military strategy guided by divine wisdom. When Israel finally enters the Promised Land, they're not just displaced refugees looking for a home. They're a disciplined army carrying out a divine mandate to establish God's kingdom on earth. Deuteronomy wasn't repetition. It was covenant renewal for a new generation. Moses isn't just reviewing old laws. He's preparing Israel for the greatest transition in their history. They're about to enter a land filled with established civilizations, advanced military technology, and seductive religious systems that promise prosperity through idolatry. Moses knows that Israel's greatest enemy won't be Canaanite armies. It will be Canaanite culture. So Deuteronomy becomes an intensive course in cultural resistance. Choose life, not death. Choose blessing, not curse. Choose the God who created nations, not the gods that nations create. The historical books reveal God's patience with human failure and his commitment to ultimate victory. Joshua and Judges show us that conquest isn't just military, it's spiritual. Every victory depends on obedience. Every defeat results from compromise. The cycle repeats endlessly. Sin leads to oppression. Oppression leads to crying out. Crying out leads to deliverance. Deliverance leads to peace. Peace leads to complacency. Complacency leads back to sin. But here's the pattern most Christians miss. Even in failure, God's purposes advance. Even when Israel rebels, God is working. Even when kings disappoint, the promise endures. The historical books aren't primarily about human heroes. They're about divine faithfulness in spite of human faithlessness. Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles weren't just royal biographies. They were theological interpretations of political history. Why did Saul fail? Because he tried to be king without acknowledging the true king. Why did David succeed despite moral failures? Because he always returned to dependence on God. Why did Solomon's glory turn to division? Because he confused human wisdom with divine wisdom. The message is consistent. Human power without divine submission leads to destruction, while human weakness with divine dependence leads to victory. This wasn't ancient political theory. This was prophetic instruction for every generation that would face the temptation to trust in horses and chariots rather than the name of the Lord. The wisdom books reveal God's character through human experience. Job wasn't just about suffering. It was about the limits of human understanding and the sufficiency of divine character. When everything Job thought he knew about God proved inadequate, he discovered something better than explanations. He discovered God himself. Psalms wasn't just worship music. It was emotional education for people learning to live in relationship with the divine. Every psalm teaches us that God can handle our honest emotions, our desperate questions, our angry complaints, and our overwhelming praise. The Psalms prove that authentic spirituality isn't about pretending everything is fine. It's about bringing everything to God and finding Him faithful in every circumstance. Proverbs wasn't just practical advice. It was character formation through accumulated wisdom. Fear of the Lord isn't terror of divine wrath. It's recognition of divine authority that leads to practical wisdom for everyday decisions. Every proverb points to the same truth. Life works better when we align with reality, and God defines reality. Ecclesiastes wasn't pessimistic philosophy. It was realistic evaluation of life without God. When Solomon explores every possible source of meaning apart from divine relationship, he discovers a futility that drives humans to despair. The book's message isn't life is meaningless. The message is life is meaningless without God, so return to Him. Song of Songs wasn't just love poetry. It was celebration of human intimacy as a reflection of divine love. Physical passion isn't embarrassing or shameful. It's a gift that points to the passionate love between God and His people. The church that's uncomfortable with Song of Songs has forgotten that Christianity is about relationship, not rules. The prophets weren't just moral critics. They were covenant prosecutors calling Israel back to their original purpose. When Isaiah condemns social injustice, he's not introducing new ethical standards. He's reminding Israel of commitments they made at Sinai. When Jeremiah announces judgment, he's not being vindictive. He's explaining the inevitable consequences of covenant violation. But here's what transforms everything about the prophets. They never end with judgment. Every prophetic book points forward to restoration, renewal, and the coming of God's kingdom in its fullness. The prophets weren't pessimists. They were ultimate optimists who believed that God's purposes would triumph despite human rebellion. The exile books reveal God's sovereignty over international politics and his commitment to keeping promises across generations. Daniel wasn't just about surviving persecution. It was about maintaining faith when everything looks hopeless. Ezra and Nehemiah weren't just about rebuilding walls. They were about reconstructing identity and purpose after national collapse. Even in exile, even under foreign domination, even when the temple lay in ruins, God was working. The Old Testament ends not with triumph, but with anticipation. The promises remain unfulfilled. The kingdom isn't yet established. The nations still need blessing. Something more is coming. Here's the secret that unlocks everything. The Old Testament isn't complete. It's the first act of a two-act play. Every promise points forward. Every type and shadow anticipates reality. Every prophecy awaits fulfillment. The Old Testament doesn't make sense without the New Testament. And the New Testament doesn't make sense without the Old Testament. The genealogies that seem boring, they're tracing the line through which God will enter human history. The laws that seem restrictive, they're revealing the holiness that Christ will fulfill. The sacrifices that seem primitive, they're pointing to the ultimate sacrifice that removes sin forever. The kingdom promises that seem delayed, they're describing the reign that begins with a Jewish carpenter and extends to every tribe and nation. When you understand the Old Testament's architecture, every book becomes a window into God's character and a preview of his ultimate plan. This is an ancient history. This is a foundation for understanding who God is, what he's doing, and how your life fits into his eternal purposes. The Old Testament proves that God keeps his promises, even when it takes centuries. It proves that God's ways work, even when they seem foolish to human wisdom. It proves that God's love endures, even through human rebellion and failure. Most importantly, it proves that God's story isn't finished, and neither is yours. If this helped you see the Old Testament in a completely new light, tap subscribe now and turn on notifications. Understanding Scripture's architecture changes everything about how you read your Bible, how you understand God's character, and how you live out your faith in a world that desperately needs the blessing God promised through Abraham to all nations.